You see, out of all the ancient manuscripts, the copies of Mark's Gospel that we have, and they go back to, to the 200 AD or something like that. The earliest ones, and so the most reliable ones, do end at verse 8, where Ilke ended for us. But you'll notice, depending on what Bible you've got, some of them then have a 9 to 20 as well. In mine, it's in italics, I think. And that ending is one of two alternative endings that it seems have been added later, that they turn up on some of the later manuscripts. It seems added later by someone other than Mark. It seems like it uses information from the other Gospels to put a nice, neat summary on the end of Mark's Gospel. But the earliest scribes who copied out, the Gospel, obviously didn't want to tamper with the original that they had as they had it. They were more bothered about faithfully recording what they knew Mark had written. But it does mean the Gospel ends rather abruptly, as you saw, maybe even rather awkwardly. Most scholars think that the original ending either got lost or Mark never got round to writing it for some reason. Maybe something happened to Mark and he couldn't complete it. Or more likely, perhaps, the end of the scroll got torn off. Actually, that happened now and again with these ancient scrolls. In fact, I was seeing something on the telly the other day about the Bayeux Tapestry. I think that's what happened to the Bayeux Tapestry, wasn't it? The end got torn off. It happened, unfortunately. On the other hand, some people think that he meant to end like that, with rather an abrupt and sudden ending. But in any case, look, in God's providence, this is what we have from Mark. So I think we should seriously consider the words that we know were Mark's and see what we learn from it. Because some particular thoughts come out because of the way Mark's Gospel ends. So let me just pick out some of the interesting facts from what we've read. We heard first about Joseph, who buried Jesus. I'm always inspired by Joseph when we read about him. He was a prominent member of the council. Now remember, that's the council of Jewish leaders that sentenced Jesus to death, basically. So they weren't all bad, because here's Joseph. Maybe he hadn't been at the trial of Jesus. Maybe he just got outvoted. I don't know. In John's Gospel, it tells us that he was a secret disciple. Well, he may have been secret before, but now he went boldly to Pilate to ask for Jesus' body. Well, it was now out in the open. He was a Christian. That took some courage when most of the other disciples were hiding behind locked doors at this particular point in time. And Matthew adds that it was Joseph's own tomb that he donated, if you like, for Jesus to be put into. So there's that, all about Joseph. Mark clearly wants us to know that Jesus was dead. Okay? He says Pilate checked it because Jesus had died a bit sooner than most people did on the cross, after a mere 6 hours. Well, we won't think too much more about that at the moment. So Pilate checked it. The centurion confirmed it. That was his job. He knew how to do his job. And then the body was carefully prepared for burial by Joseph. Joseph got close up and personal with the body of Jesus. Not particularly pleasant, I would have thought, when you think what had happened to Jesus before the cross and on the cross. But that was something Joseph was just pleased to do for his master who he loved. Well, he would have seen any signs of life still there if there was any hope at all. So that's interesting to read. The women, I always love to read about the women. They were followers of Jesus who showed their love and their loyalty quite amazingly. It was they who stayed near the cross where Jesus died. It was they who came to watch where Joseph buried the body. And it was they who first returned to the tomb on the third day to care for the body. And we know they wouldn't have gone to the wrong tomb because they'd been there previously. They saw where Jesus had been buried. It's a wonderful affirmation of the importance and worth of women in Christian thought and teaching, that they were first to hear and tell the news of the resurrection. Contrasts sharply with the culture of the day, of course. Women were counted very much inferior compared to the men, and in a court of law, the testimony of the women wasn't accepted. A woman couldn't testify in court. And yet the way things end in Mark's Gospel, everything depends on their testimony. I think that's rather lovely. Everything relies on them spreading the news of the resurrection. And then the tomb was sealed with a heavy stone. Joseph saw to it that happened. The stone was so heavy that the women knew that even together they were not going to be able to roll it away. It's Matthew who tells us that the angel rolled away the stone. And that angel was now sitting there waiting to announce to the women the astonishing news that Jesus had risen, something which quite clearly they had no expectation of finding. The angel said to them, "See the place where they laid him." See the place where they laid him. You know, the resurrection is based on eyewitness accounts. The other Gospels add many more, of course, reports from those who actually saw Jesus alive again. And without all of these accounts, without the faith of those eyewitnesses, well, there would be no Christian church today. The angel said, Jesus was crucified and has risen. This is the heart of the gospel, the good news of Jesus. And actually, Mark's rather abrupt ending does ensure that the resurrection is the real climax at the end of his gospel, which of course it should be, because that's the event which makes sense of and validates everything else that happened. And then Mark ends by saying the women said nothing, meaning, of course, until they got back to the other disciples. We know they then told them, as the other Gospels say to us. So there's just a few fascinating details in Mark's account. But my attention ended up focused on just one word in these verses. Just one word. The word go. Spoken to the women by the angel. Go. And it got me thinking about all that it meant. That word, that little word. What it meant then and what it still means to us now. Go. For a start, I think that word go meant go in faith. Go in faith, having heard the good news that Jesus was crucified and has risen. In other words, believe and go. The angel wants them to believe on the basis of his testimony, coupled with what they've seen for themselves, that Jesus is alive. And actually it means that at the end of Mark's Gospel we're left with a state of affairs which is much more easy for us to relate to, because we, like the women here, haven't had a physical appearance of Jesus to convince us about who he is and that he's alive. We must believe on the basis of the teaching passed on to us in the Bible, in our case, and the witness of other Christians and our own experiences, of course, in life. It's a bit reminiscent of Jesus' words in John's Gospel. If you remember, following his appearance to Thomas, he said, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." So we, like those women, must make a choice based on what we've heard and what we've experienced ourselves, to have faith and believe or not. But if we do choose to believe, then it doesn't stop there, of course. It can't do. That belief must change then what we do, how we live. Having faith in Jesus means having faith in what he says and following his teaching. And in particular, here's the next go. He's teaching, go and tell others. That's what that word go meant as well. Go and tell others. The angel said, tell his disciples, Jesus' disciples, and Peter. Tell his disciples and Peter. So yet again, we're confronted with that primary task or mission that's given to all believers, to go and tell. Again, this good news is not something to keep to ourselves. We must pass it on to others. We must be witnesses, both of the message we've received regarding the truth of our crucified and risen Lord, and just as importantly, witnesses to our own life experiences about how believing in Jesus has changed life for us. And maybe our personal story won't include things like an empty tomb and an angel, but we all have experiences to share about the difference Jesus has made to our lives, and it's crucial that we share that with others. And that's not just in the context of trying to persuade others to believe, though it is that certainly, but also about encouraging those who already have faith, our Christian brothers and sisters, with stories of what God has done in our lives. Always encouraging to share testimony of that sort. And, as we've heard Katie and Alex, they've not had spectacular miracles work in their lives. It doesn't matter. It's obvious from just talking to us in the words they could find that God has made an impact, a real impact in their lives. Interestingly, the women were given Peter's name. It's curious that, isn't it? I thought about this for a while. Tell Peter. Why was that? I can only believe that Peter was singled out because he'd recently failed Jesus miserably. Do you remember? He denied 3 times even knowing Jesus while Jesus was on trial. How wonderful for Peter when the women got back to hear that his name had been mentioned. Go and tell the disciples and Peter. That must have been a moment. It was confirmation that Peter was forgiven, that he was still accepted. The message given to the women by the angel was a message about an amazing fact, the fact of the resurrection. It was also a message of God's wonderful grace that comes to individual men and women who've failed God, however badly, to say to them, you are forgiven. And the more I think about that, one little aspect of the account that comes in just 2 words, and Peter, the more lovely that seems. That we have a God who's concerned so much for the individual person, for every individual person. So, go in faith, go and tell others. Also, go and follow Jesus. He's going ahead of you, the angel said. I love that thought, that turn of phrase. He's going ahead of you. The Christian life is about following Jesus, following his teaching, following his example. We've got to constantly keep our eye on Jesus. We say that, don't we? Try not to stray from the path that he wants to take us on in life. In the first place, we get general guidance for life through reading our Bibles, through prayer, in terms of the kind of people God wants us to be and the kind of behaviour he wants from us. But also, I believe, we do receive very personal and individual guidance from God, who reveals to us what he wants us to do in a variety of different ways. He's going ahead of you into Galilee, the disciples were told. So that's precisely where they were supposed to be heading now, and they did. See, the wonderful thing about that is that not only does Jesus have a plan for our lives and that he reveals it to us, he also actually is there ahead of us, before us, preparing the way. He's there to meet us in our future, which he knows about already. What a confidence booster that is for us all. To know that Jesus is already ahead of us. He knows what's coming. He's going to be there beside us. Matthew records for us that meeting in Galilee where they went. And it's there where Jesus made that wonderful promise to all his followers. Surely I am with you always, to the very end of the age. And the mention of Galilee brings me on to another point. You see, Galilee was the place where the majority of the disciples had come from. This is where they had homes and families and jobs. Galilee was the place of their ordinary, everyday lives. So I think the message from the angel also says to us, go and find Jesus in your ordinary, everyday lives. He's not just around in the special moments, these Easter Sunday moments or these baptismal services. He's in every part of your lives. He'll be there when you get back to your homes or your workplaces, to meet you there, to help you there, as you try to tell others about him, as you try to follow him in those places. And we need to know that too, don't we? It's wonderful to know that too. It's a challenge as well as a comfort, of course. And so, to my final point, Mark tells us that trembling and bewildered, the women went out. That's how he finishes. Trembling and bewildered, the women went out. That final instruction seems to say, go in your frailty and serve me. Go even when you feel afraid and confused to live for me because you believe. I mean, let's face it, following Jesus is scary sometimes. There's no doubt about it. And we don't have all the answers to even our own questions. But nevertheless, in faith we go. According to Mark's Gospel, God left the great responsibility of spreading the good news of his Son's glorious resurrection in the hands of a few trembling and bewildered women. And yet that just seems to fit so well for me with how God works in our world, through the likes of you and me, weak and unreliable as we are. People like Mark who lost the end off his scroll even, maybe. His glory shines all the more through our weakness. Again, this is how the grace of God is seen to be at work. Very often not among the powerful and the strong, but instead among the lowly and the weak, as they humbly seek to serve him as best they can. I like Mark's ending. I mean, I'm glad it's complemented by those other gospel accounts, but I like the particular focus Mark gives us. The brevity of it forces us to look closely at the small amount of detail there is there to see what it tells us. And when we do, we find there's plenty to learn, plenty to encourage and inspire us. And perhaps even the sense of it being unfinished is instructive, encouraging us to go out to finish the story. That's what we're about, isn't it, as Christians? It's for us to carry on the story by what we do with our lives for Jesus. So I say to you all this evening, go. Mark says to you, go. And therefore God says to you, go. Go in faith, faith in Jesus. Go to tell others of Jesus. Go and follow Jesus. Follow his path for your life. Go and find Jesus. Find him in your everyday lives, in every moment of your everyday lives, because he's there, ahead of you, waiting to meet you. This week, he's there, waiting for whatever's going to happen in your life. He's there. Go in your weakness, for he will be your strength, and he will help you to serve him in your daily lives.